You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. Deuteronomy 6:8 from the ESV. Welcome to another presentation of Hands and Eyes. I'm Mark Horn, your guide, and this is Repairing the Romans Road, number 1, which is entitled Romans 3:21 through 26 and God's Righteousness. This is part 3. Part 1 and 2 are really important. I hope you'll go back and look at those if you haven't already. Actually, I would advise you to stop this video now and go back. But in any case, let's go on. We're talking about Romans 3:21 through 26, and also in context of chapters 1 through 3 of Romans. And we're talking about the term in English, God's righteousness or His righteousness, in Romans 1 through 3. Dikai sune theou in Greek, or if in the case of the pronoun, it's autou. And of course, there's 3 times it appears in Romans 1 through 3. Romans 1:17, Romans 3:5, and then Romans 3:21 through 26, in kind of a culminating, repeated kind of passage, a paragraph that just emphasizes God's righteousness. And that's why it's so violent to the text to suddenly try to change meanings or imply or hint to the English reader that we've gone from talking about one kind of righteousness to another. It's God's righteousness or His righteousness in that passage, and that's what this is about. So we talked in our first video about that last paragraph, and then we went ahead and talked a little bit about Romans 3:5 in context, and then now we're going to talk about Romans 1:17. Let's look at Romans in broad outline. I don't think anything I'm going to say here is too controversial. We have Romans 1 through 15 is the introduction, and then we have the argument in Romans 1:16 through 11:36, and then Paul lays out a variety of applications in 12:1 to 15:21, and then finally we have a closing, Romans 15:22 to 16:27. Now, the point here is I want to isolate the argument and just point out that it begins with a quotation from Habakkuk, that's in Romans 1:17, and then it ends with a quotation from Job, that's in 11:34 and 35. It's actually a quotation of Job mixed with a quotation of Isaiah, which is very interesting, but it's something I'll forbear to talk about right now. Let me just say something about Habakkuk and Job. Both books are about whether or not a person is counted righteous before God. Now, it comes up briefly in Habakkuk, but it's what Paul quotes from, so it's obviously important to him. All right, who is righteous? We'll see the quotation in a minute. But then also, Job is all about a man named Job, and his 3 friends accuse him of being in sin. Job is being horribly, horribly oppressed. He gets sick in ways that are just unimaginable. His children all die. His wealth is all destroyed virtually, actually I think literally overnight. And he's just in a horrible, horrible state, and his friends say, well, that means God must be punishing you. Confess. And he won't confess because he says he didn't do anything wrong. Turns out he's right. He's justified by God at the end of the book. But in any case, both books are also about the question of whether or not God is righteous. Habakkuk wants to know why God is not punishing the evil he sees, and then when God explains how he's going to punish the evil he sees, Habakkuk wants to know how a righteous God could use such horrible people to punish the sins of Israel. Job, likewise, Job's 3 friends insist that if God is righteous, that in fact Job must be unrighteous. And Job, by disputing that, his friends accuse him of calling God unrighteous. That's not Job's intent. Though God himself confesses to Satan very near the beginning of the book that he was incited to inflict wrath on Job without cause. That's God's own term for it, without cause. Makes him suffer without cause. So that's another issue. Job and Habakkuk both qualify as what we might call theodicies. It's a term for the question of God's righteousness in the midst of either sin or suffering or something like that. So let's look then at Romans 1:16 through 17. My point here is that the letter to the Romans, while it obviously is about how sinners are righteous with God or right with God or can become right with God, that it's by faith and that it's through Christ and His redemption alone. It's also about whether or not God is righteous. And so there's every reason to expect God's righteousness to come up, about His own character, whether it can be vindicated or not, and it does. So, Romans 1:16 through 17. We read, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it God's righteousness is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." Now, I'm going to make some points about this. First of all, the most natural reading is the same as the uses in Romans 3. It's God's own character. God's own character is revealed in the gospel. All right? What's revealed in the gospel reflects on God's own character and vindicates his righteousness. The passage begins and ends with how believers are saved, but that doesn't mean it's all about that. Let's look at the passage again. See, the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, there at the beginning, and then the righteous shall live by faith is a demonstration of that. So the gospel is the power of God for salvation. But the question is, that's not the same as a question as what the gospel as a message reveals. For in it, God's righteousness is revealed. See, God's righteousness or faithfulness denotes his act, which should be believed. In the beginning of Romans, it's the gospel is about Jesus living and dying and rising again. All right, it's about the Son of God. That's Romans 1, 3 through 4. But we've already talked about it also in Romans 3, 5, and then elsewhere, 3, 21 through 26, God's righteousness, we're told, is on display in the unrighteous, unfaithful act of men. All right, that's 3, 5, that resulted in the propitiation, the shed blood of Jesus. That's 3, 21 through 26. And it's not rocket science. He's talking about the crucifixion of Jesus that we read about at the end of and the climax of all the Gospels. All right, their putting Jesus to death was unfaithful on Israel's part, but God was using it to bring about the salvation of the human race that is faithful on God's part. He's being righteous. So the gospel, by preaching Christ crucified, as well as risen from the dead, presents the righteousness of God, which is to be believed, and which in so doing is the power of salvation to all who believe. I guess I just stole my thunder there. As the message, the gospel is the message about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. As the message about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the gospel reveals God's righteousness. Compare Psalm 98:2, by the way, which Paul is almost certainly quoting from, and there it is. The Lord, or Yahweh, has made known his salvation. He has revealed his righteousness in the sight of the nations. All right? Paul says the gospel makes known salvation. By what? In so doing, it reveals his righteousness for Jew and Gentile alike. Gentile is just another word for nations. Nations outside of Israel. So let me just conclude by restating all this. The most natural reading is God's righteousness, that it refers to acts that reveal and vindicate God's own character. There is no reason to change the wording in English in order to make the reader think righteousness of God really means righteousness from God. Just because something is true doesn't give us the right to insert it where it does not belong, i.e. where it's not already there in the text. Duh. Well, that's all I have to say. Please send me your feedback. You can go to handseyes.org/contact if you'd like to donate so I can do more of these and do them faster and do them better and perhaps redo the ones that need to be redone. handseyes.org/donate. Thank you very much for your time. I'll see you at the next video.